Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This episode is brought to you by Buffalo Trace Distillery. Powerful yet smooth. Contained but never tame. Proudly going their own way, but never going alone. This is the spirit inside Buffalo Trace Bourbon. Made at Buffalo Trace Distillery, the world's most award-winning distillery. Buffalo Trace is always perfectly untamed. Distilled, aged, and bottled by Buffalo Trace Distillery, Franklin County, Kentucky. 90 proof, 45% alcohol by volume. Learn more at buffalotracedistillery.com. Please drink responsibly.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media. On TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now, you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. And as always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Shout out to Desi, host of the Dead podcast, for this episode suggestion. Important note, sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. Let's start with a question. What comes to mind when you think of the boogeyman? For some, it calls to mind a horrifying creature lurking in the shadows of a dark room, or hiding in a closet. For others, it conjures images of a monster living under your bed, waiting for an opportunity to snatch you in your sleep. Still for others, the boogeyman is representative of their deepest fears or phobias, the things that scare you to death and that you'll avoid at all costs. For me, I love horror movies, so the boogeyman in some ways reminds me of Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, or perhaps the most famous knife-wielding maniac of all, Michael Myers. For children growing up in Latin America, Mexico, and in Spanish-speaking communities across the United States, the boogeyman isn't a horror movie villain. Instead, it's a beautiful woman with long black hair and a distinct calling card: weeping. She's known as La Llorona, or the Weeping Woman. And encounters with her go back over 500 years to the time of the conquistadores. And though she may not fit the stereotypical mold of the boogeyman, make no mistake, an encounter with La Llorona is both terrifying and potentially deadly. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the disturbing and legitimately scary story of La Llorona. Who is she? And what would you do if you came face to face with the Weeping Woman? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. Imagine for a moment you're walking on a hiking trail. After a few hours, you're deep in the woods and thinking you should turn around and head back to the car, especially since it'll be sunset soon. As you're walking, the wind picks up and you zip up your jacket to keep the cold out. That's when you hear it, a faint moaning, almost like someone is crying, and it's coming from somewhere in the surrounding woods. You can hear it clearly, but you can't make out where it's coming from. So, you keep walking, this time a bit faster. A few minutes go by, and you recognize the clearing up ahead. Another 10 to 15 minutes and you'll be back at the car. As your thoughts wander to dinner, you hear it again, moaning and crying. Except this time, it's much closer. But you still can't make out the direction of the sound, though it sounds like it's coming from somewhere up ahead. You start to jog, trying to cut your time back to the car in half. But just as you get to the edge of the clearing, you notice a woman standing on the trail, maybe 150 feet in front of you. Except she's not dressed in walking or hiking attire. Instead, she's wearing what appears to be a white, flowing dress. Because of the shadows, you can't see her face. But as your eyes adjust to the lighting, you notice that her head is down, and all you can see is long, scraggly, jet black hair. A few seconds pass, and as she lifts her head, a silent scream forms in the back of your throat. You notice the pale, gaunt skin on her face, and her eyes are black, empty holes. And then you hear the familiar moaning and weeping. The origins of La Llorona are as varied as the encounters told by eyewitnesses. We'll start with the most well-known version. According to legend, La Llorona was a beautiful woman named Maria, who grew up poor in a small village. Her beauty was striking and captivated the men from nearby towns. Though she was of humble means, Maria often dressed in a white gown at night, hoping to attract the attention and affection of a rich passerby. One man caught Maria's attention, though he rejected her advances and left her with the pain of unrequited love. After the rejection of her supposed soulmate, Maria walked her children down to the river, where she drowned them in an act of revenge. Realizing what she'd done, Maria mourned her children day and night and, quote, walked along the river in her white gown, searching for her boys, hoping they would return to her, end quote. She cried and moaned and wept, hoping and longing for her children to return to her. But no matter what she did, they never came back. Unable to live with the guilt of her murderous actions, Maria died by suicide. It is said that when Maria reached the gates of heaven, she was not granted entry because her children were not with her. Instead, she was banished to wander the earth, where to this day, La Llorona moans and weeps while searching for her children. Variations of the story include Maria discovering her lover's infidelity, and in an act of rage and revenge, she drowns her children. Other versions claim her lover was the children's father, and that he left her for another woman, leading to her murderous outburst. And yet another version claims Maria faded into death after being overcome with grief, and after refusing to eat or drink, she died on the banks of the river where she drowned her children. Perhaps the most well-known variation is the claim that La Llorona is the, quote, Ghost of La Malinche, a real Nahua woman who was the translator for Hernán Cortés and gave birth to his children. Eventually, Cortés left her for a Spanish woman, and according to legend, she killed her children in a fit of rage. End quote. More than a ghostly specter, La Llorona is merciless in her aggression towards those who encounter her. In fact, families across Latin America, Mexico, and Spanish-speaking communities warn their children about going into the woods alone to avoid an encounter with La Llorona. In most versions of the story, La Llorona is said to kidnap and often kill wayward children who fail to listen to their parents. One article stated, quote, La Llorona typically appears as a malevolent spirit, either a harbinger or a direct cause of misfortune to the living. Sometimes she takes the form of a dangerous siren, tempting a solitary male late at night by confronting him as a pitiful, woebegone figure hidden under a rebozo. When offered assistance, she turns on the solicitous gentleman, the face of a skeleton or a wild metallic horse's head, or no face at all. Sometimes, she is observed simply roaming about at a distance, or most typically, she is heard weeping and shrieking through the night. A chance meeting with her is dangerous. End quote. Another article stated, quote, though the legends vary, the apparition is said to act without hesitation or mercy. The tales of her cruelty depend on the version of the legend you hear. Some say that she kills indiscriminately, taking men, women, and children, whoever is foolish enough to get close enough to her. Others say she is very barbaric and only kills children, dragging them screaming to a watery grave. End quote. I mentioned that encounters with La Llorona go back nearly 500 years. Here are 3 encounters from a more recent time. Our first encounter is from a deleted Reddit user. Quote, I grew up in a small town in Mexico where there are many paranormal stories. What is certain is that the weeping woman is the one that marked me for life. When my maternal grandmother died, I was 15 years old, and my uncles did not want my grandfather to be alone. So I was the one who had to go to sleep at my grandfather's house every night and keep him company. One night, after playing soccer with my friends, I was late, and I knew that there was no one to save me. I had to go to sleep at my grandfather's house and cross the dark roads, the river, and the bridge. When I arrived at my grandfather's house, all was normal. My dog was waiting for me. He was the one who gave him company during the day. He was a husky, all white and huge. I sat in an armchair next to my grandfather's bed while he watched the news on television. And at 11 p.m., he turned off the TV and went to bed. 20 minutes later, my dog was restless. He was squealing, barking, and moving a lot. And that made me restless since my dog is not afraid of anything. And that's when it all started. We heard a crying, deep and full of pain. It had an echo. There was a large window between my grandfather's bed and mine, and my dog was under the bed crying. The crying outside was capable of paralyzing you, of freezing your soul. And every time I tried to move closer to the window, I found I could not move at all. After about 3 minutes, my dog stopped crying and came out from under the bed to bark. But the crying outside was gone. My grandfather simply laughed and told me that such a loud woman doesn't let him sleep. End quote. Our second encounter is from Reddit user Della Curls. Quote, "All right, so this story has been told to me by my mom a few times. And every single time I still get that creepy feeling, that eerie feeling that someone is watching me. My mom is from a small town in Mexico, located in Zacatecas. When she was around 14, she had the habit of waking her mom up to go to the restroom, since it was an older home, and the restroom was located outside. My mom told me that it was around 3 a.m. when she woke up, and she felt the need to use the restroom urgently. So, she began calling out for her mom. But after a while of her mom not responding, she began getting agitated and started screaming. At that point, my mom turns around, and at the foot of her bed, she sees her mom standing there. She was wearing a white robe, but had a very bleak expression on her face, and both of her arms were extended. My mom said that she suddenly felt extremely cold and an overwhelming sense of dread. She had never seen her mom wear a white robe. That's when she looked down and saw her mom's feet weren't touching the floor. At that moment, she screamed and quickly threw the covers over her head. Her mom, wearing something completely different, runs in to find my mom shaking in her bed. Nobody believed my mom. Everyone told her it was a dream. Until a few days later, when there was a power outage. And during this time, my mom and a few of her siblings, with her parents, all decided to sleep in the living room. At around the same time, at 3 a.m., they heard the same undeniable wails of La Llorona down their street. None of them slept that night." End quote. Our final encounter is from Reddit user DJ Underdog85. Quote, "This happened to me when I was about 11 years old. It was in the 1990s, and I have lived my whole life in El Paso, Texas. The culture is rich in folklore and religious beliefs, and many Hispanic families have stories of the paranormal. One night, it was just like any other night. I lived in a trailer with my mom and dad. My youngest brother was staying with my aunt this night. I fell asleep watching Jay Leno as usual, and when I woke up, I was on the sofa in my living room. The time was 4 a.m., which illuminated from the stove in the kitchen. The television was off, and normally I had a light on, but this time it was pitch black. I woke up, and I heard a horrible screaming that was coming from far in the distance. The screaming was coming from a ditch that was a few feet away from my home. I heard it, and I thought I was hearing things. I asked myself, am I dreaming? Then, I started to hear the animals outside howling and whimpering. These animals that I speak of are cats and dogs. As the screaming got closer, the animals continued to cry. The screaming was something I have never experienced ever before. It sounded like I was in a big hallway, and a woman was screaming her guts out down that hallway. Then, in all the screaming, I started to make out words. These words being said by whoever this was at 4 a.m. shocked me. The woman said, "Ay, mis hijos," which means, "Oh, my children." In a huge panic, I quickly got up from the sofa and ran to the kitchen, which was right next to where I was asleep. I turned the closest light on and looked around. The screaming didn't stop. In fact, the screaming only got louder and closer. I questioned my sanity at that moment. Was I going crazy or hearing things? Then I thought to myself, this is real, and the animals are responding to it in a negative way. So, I did what any other 11-year-old boy would do in a moment like this. I ran to my mom and dad's room. I reached out for my mom and shook her awake wildly. She woke up slowly, and to my amazement, the screaming faded away as she woke up. I thought to myself, what the heck is going on? I told my mother, "Mom, do you hear that screaming and crying lady?" My mom was half asleep as she said, "Go back to sleep. It is most likely just your imagination." I told her, "No, this is real. Please listen. Don't you hear her?" My mom quickly just said, "You are dreaming, so go back to sleep. It's going to be okay." By then, the screaming had faded away, as if whoever was screaming knew that an adult was awake. I was terrified as I returned to the living room and quickly turned on the television and left on most of the lights as well. I didn't go back to sleep until the sun came up. I couldn't believe what I heard and witnessed. I was being treated like a crazy person whenever I told my story. It got so bad that I kept my experience to myself. To this day, I don't care what people think of my experience. I know what I heard. A couple of years later, it happened to me again. But that's a whole other story for another time. End quote. As unsettling as these stories are, what's equally disturbing is La Llorona continues to show up. Quote, "The Hispanic people believe that the weeping woman will always be with them, following the many rivers looking for her children. For this reason, many of them fear the dark and pass the legend from generation to generation." End quote. I'll admit, the story of La Llorona hits me differently than other boogeyman-type stories. Maybe it's because of the tragic, unsettling backstory. Or maybe it's because I'm Puerto Rican, and this one resonates at the deepest part of who I am. Whatever it is, I know one thing for sure. The last thing I want to hear while in the woods is weeping. And the last thing I want to see is a woman with long black hair and dressed in a white gown. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with this lingering question. What would you do if while traipsing through the woods, you came face to face with La Llorona? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.